Hey guys, how you doing today? And I'm gonna start my grief series. I decided, I've tried to a few months back. It was a little hard, so I'm ready now. Today I'm gonna start out with one of the big things I think that happens immediately upon losing a loved one from death. And that's the do's and the don'ts. Because unfortunately, a lot of people don't really understand the impact they have on the grieving with their words and their actions, because they're not in that same space as the people that are grieving. So things are different to people grieving. One of the biggest things I find in grief mentoring is that most people are left alone to deal with their grief within a few weeks of the loss. And yes, there are some people that have great families, and I don't want to put everybody in this category because some people have great support. Most people are back to normal, going about their daily lives, and they may shoot you a quick text saying, you know, do you need anything? Which you will always respond to, no, because that's what we do when we're grieving. So what I suggest people do is I suggest to people that want to help and support people going through grief to form a watch party. And that way it's not too hard on anybody that is participating in it, right? Because it does get hard dealing with a person with grief because they want to talk about the loss all the time. They want to talk about, a lot of times, reliving it over and over because that's what's going on in their brain, their pain, right? And it's really difficult to be the person day after day to listen to that. I know I only had that one person that was really listening to me day after day. Thank God I had one, right? And so it's hard. So forming a watch party makes it so much better for the grieving because somebody's showing up. And it makes it so much better for the people helping the people grieving because the same person isn't carrying the weight day after day, month after month, okay? Because that wears people down in a family, right? Grief wears people down. And the whole entire family can fall apart, split up, have a lot of emotional conflicts simply because they're so devastated with grief that they're taking it out on each other. So how do you form a watch party? You talk to the neighbors, you talk to their friends, family members. What a lot of people don't realize is when you're in grief and you've just had a terrible loss, it seems like you just get one loss after another after that. That's part of the grieving process, okay? We lose people, all right? Because people don't come around anymore. When you lose your wife or your husband or a child, you're gonna lose people that used to come around that no longer do. So it's just the beginning of loss, right? Kids and parents sometimes can't support each other because they're having their own grief and going through it in different ways. And that's why it's so important to have community support and friendships, okay? So get a watch party going from anybody you know that's grieving. Don't put it on yourself, you know? Put it on everybody. Bring things, don't ask. People grieving aren't really caring about anything. They're just in their own world. So if you say, do you want me to come over and bring you some milk or supper or, you know, lots of times they'll just say, no thanks, I'm fine. People who are grieving most of the time will just say, no thank you. So bring them things, bring them a coffee, bring them milk, bring them a cake, some sweets, anything. Stop by with things for them because they're not taking care of themselves. Just bring anything to show you care. Okay? And anything that will help their life be easier, like a dinner, right? Or maybe toilet paper, who knows? Heck, think of things like that, right? Things that you can help them with, and don't ask them because they're just gonna say, don't worry about it, okay? Help people grieving without asking, all right? Interrupt and intrude. They need it. They won't ask for help. Another one that is very frustrating for people who lose people is if you are with someone grieving and they're talking negatively, like they want to kill themselves, they're worthless, they have no reason to live anymore, this is common, just listen. Don't tell them, no, you don't want to say that. Don't say that. It's going to get better. They don't want to hear that, and it's very, very irritating to someone grieving. We want to die when our loved ones die. We don't want to hear we're going to get better. So listen without advice. okay? No advice. And while we're talking about the no advice, also, we should get to that place where we don't compare death either. So when we're talking about what we're saying to grieving people now, don't compare, you know how they feel because your dog died a year ago. Don't even compare a spouse and a spouse. There are so many differences for losses, depending on how they were lost, when they were lost, why they were lost. To even try to say your loss is comparable will not go over well. The person who's grieving, it's the biggest loss, the worst loss. It's horrible. So I know a lot of people think it's a helpful statement to say, I know how you feel when I lost my husband 2 years ago to cancer. No, you don't. My husband hung himself. You don't. It's different. It's complicated grief. And we'll talk about that on a different video. So that's why a lot of times people grieving will lose friends and family members as well because of conflict. They're in so much grief and people are trying to help them. They feel helpful, but the person in grief, they just feel like you're trying to give them advice that they don't want to take, and you're trying to compare your grief to theirs and they don't want to hear it. Okay, so this is about the grieving person. It's not about anybody else. So you got to show up and be there for them. Whatever they may be saying, let them. And just say, I understand. Or, I'm so sorry you feel like this. There's really good statements you can practice before, right? And they're the same statements over and over, and you just use those, right? You don't say, I know, because, and talk about your grief. That's not what they want. All right, another do and don't. Love them, don't judge them. Everybody grieves differently. And I mean very differently. After being in like 6 different widows groups after my husband died online, wow, you know? So I learned a lot about grief in these groups and how people are very, very different. And some people are out, you know, finding someone new right away. And at first, to me, that was like, oh my God, how do you do that, right? I don't say that anymore. I get it. I get it. You don't get it unless you go through it and you've been there. So some people may say they're never marrying again. And you'll be saying, that's silly. But in the beginning, obviously when you're grieving, there's a lot of things going on in your head, and some of those things continue on and some don't. So if somebody says they're never gonna get married, or they just gotta go out and get laid, or gotta move to the mountains, or sell the house, right? I'm gonna buy a Rolex watch. Who knows what people are gonna do after death? It doesn't matter. Allow it. Don't judge it. You don't have a right to tell them not to drink. You don't have a right to tell them not to smoke. You don't have a right to tell them not to screw. You don't have a right to tell them not to travel or to stay shut in their house for a year. Okay? You don't have that right. Nobody should judge a grieving person. All that matters is staying alive. And I know anybody watching this that has been through the type of grief I've been through, with losing my father at 18, the suicide of my brother at 24. I was 24, he was 26. And now my husband that I found hanging, 3 years ago. It's hard to want to live. So therefore, if a person has to do any of those things that they get judged for when grieving, let them. Don't judge them. They're alive. A lot of widows don't make it, and a lot of widowers don't make it. We don't hear about that. We do in our mentor groups when we see a message the next day that says, you remember so-and-so? Just thought I'd let the group know they didn't make it. They left a 7 and 9-year-old. And that's not just the grief of losing a loved one, it's the grief of losing friendships, communities, family members after losing the loved one. It's grief from people judging them because they dated too soon or they drank too much. It's people staying away because they are awkward and they don't know what to do. It's people staying away from them because they just can't listen to that anymore. That's what causes people grieving not to make it. And the last don't blame people. All right? And complicated griefers really probably understand this more than those going through regular grief, because complicated grief is usually there's someone to blame. Complicated grief is suicide, right? People like to blame. I was blamed. Broke my heart. Again, another loss. Not only did I lose my husband, but I lost people because they decided it was my fault that he hung himself. That was tough. That was a tough one. So don't blame people. No matter who was behind the wheel when someone was driving, no matter what the last words were you ever said to each other, doesn't matter. None of that matters. There should never be blame. Okay? So those are my do's and my don'ts for grieving. And I think it's a really good place to start, right? If you're grieving right now and you're seeing this, send this video to your friends and family so they understand how to treat you while you're grieving. You're just going to be able to send this video and say, here, this is what I need. And then they can form a watch party. And then they won't compare deaths. They'll just listen. They won't judge. They won't blame. Because they know you're barely hanging on. All right? See, this is why I didn't do this 2 months ago. But, you know, this is close to my heart. I've had a lot of loss. And as much as I'm crying, I've gotten through a lot of loss, and I'm a survivor of a lot of loss. And life does go on, and it can be beautiful. All right? So we'll see you next time on these grief talks, I guess I'll call them. I didn't have a name. And to anybody watching that's suffering, I know. Time's your friend. You're going to be okay. And anybody that's trying to help someone suffering, pass this around to their people. So people know to be there, to show up, and to not judge. And you can follow me at Kimberly Dawn Empath on Facebook, or you can join my Facebook group, All Things Afterlife. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Thanks for watching, guys. See you next week.